Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And in this video I'm going to show you how I put together simple top-down pixel art houses like these ones. And I thought I'd actually have more to say for this intro, but maybe let's just get right into it then instead. We'll start by making a simple house with an angled roof. And to get going I'm using an 8x8 grid to block out an initial area of 32x48 for the main body of the house. One of the early decisions we can make here is for the exact angle of the roof itself. And for this, it's often beneficial to use some repeated unit to generate a pixel-perfect line. In the first example, I'm creating the roof at an exact 45-degree angle of pixels. And for the second, I'm going to use a line composed of 2 pixel segments. Both work pretty well, and the first one is obviously a pointier look, with the second one then being more shallow or less pronounced. I'm going to move forward with the second option for now, because I think it's feeling just a bit more natural for what I was imagining in this perspective. I'm going to do some basic color blocking using this 4-color grayscale palette here, and this will give sort of that Game Boy-esque level of fidelity. And I'll have the main body of the house in the lighter gray, with the roof in the darker gray just so there's some noticeable contrast in materials. To generate the shingle pattern, I'm going to replicate that 2-pixel line along the roof at regular intervals, and then I'll draw repeating lines in the other direction to section it off like a grid. In this case, I've drawn this at every 4th pixel, and I like the pattern that it started to create, so this will be a good foundation for the shingles. At this point it's still looking a bit flat, and this is because the roof is still just a flat sheet on top of that boxy home. So I'm going to introduce some dimensionality by bumping up the midline, and then adding kind of like an edge or a trim to the roof along the front. From here I'll detail the individual shingles with an edge highlight on their left side just to make them pop a little bit. And then to counter this, the right side of the roof could be shaded darker since it's actually facing away from that newly defined light source. Due to the 4-color limit that I'm using, this means that the shaded side of the roof is mostly in that black color. But I've left a small edge detail just to maintain the impression of that shingle texture. So the roof is off to a good start, and now the rest of the house needs to follow that same level of rendering. On top of that, I think it's important to find ways to break up flat edges with pieces that give some more complex shape to the silhouette. Like seeing if it works to insert beams, some kind of trim, or other details that give a slight bump when looking along those terminating edges. I improvised this beam running along the front, and then tried to work it into the architecture of the doorway just so it looked like it was meant to be there in a way. But really one of my favorite things that pieces like this introduce is just that we get a bit of dimensionality when looking along the sides and the bottom of the house, rather than it just being a flat line. So after figuring out what the breakup and line work was going to be, I continue going through to add in some details and highlights. And in this case, I've used the light tone to give kind of a highlight edge to some of the faces here. And then I've gone in with the darker gray to create kind of a bit of shadow and weathering along the walls. Up on the roof, what I'm doing here is actually just kind of like inserting single pixels of the shade color into the black line work to try to break it up some more and hopefully create a more interesting shingle pattern. In the case of the darker side of the roof, there's not really the same reasoning behind this, but I felt it was important to kind of translate this idea over anyway by just adding another pixel. And it changed the pattern to kind of mirror what was going on with the first side. So here's a look at that finalized design. And I've created a few variants just to explore different color palettes. So here's one in kind of a Game Boy green styling. And then another with this custom 8-color palette to see how that base design might translate into something with a higher color count. So this is a good foundation for this particular viewpoint on the angled roof, but I also wanted to explore another type of view, like if we were looking at a house with an angled roof that runs in the other direction. We could imagine that in this top-down perspective, viewing an angled roof from the side might mean that we really only observe one side of it, because the other side is basically covered up and not visible from that viewpoint. In this case, I'm basically just making a flat box for the roof and then filling it in with the shingle pattern and having that beam running along the top to cap it all off. And that ends up looking something like this. Another approach would be to imagine that we are actually able to see the side of the roof that's sloping away from us. Except in this case, the shingle pattern is going to be compressed or distorted because we're catching it at kind of a sharper angle than the side that's facing us directly. So to do this, I've copied over the original pattern and compressed it evenly by just moving the rows in one at a time. And then after adding in that middle beam again, that really helped to create the visible divide between those two halves of the roof. And we end up with something that's reasonable enough to work for this perspective. With a bit of simple iteration on these base designs, it's pretty easy to turn these ideas into more unique buildings and like making little combinations out of pieces of them. And then additional decorations with signs and stuff like that could have them work for shops as well. Also, I realized I never talked about a flat roof design, so I'm just going to kind of shoehorn this in right now. But I think that one's a little easier to plan out than the angled designs. For that one, I took the same idea of not using a flat edge all the way up. And so this ledge is actually protruding from the building just to show a bit of dimension again, even if it is a pretty simple design otherwise. Alright, we'll close this out with some CRT time. So I hope you enjoyed seeing these come together, and thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.